The moment you lose everything is the moment someone unexpected can change your life forever. Lily Carter stood under the dim glow of a flickering streetlight, rain soaking through her thin jacket, the cold seeping into her skin as if it had nowhere else to go. And maybe it didn't, because she had nowhere left either. Not anymore. Not after the eviction notice folded in her pocket. Not after the job that disappeared with a single quiet email. Not after the last person she thought would stay simply stopped answering her calls. And now all she had was a worn suitcase at her feet and a single piece of paper clutched in her hand, edges softened from time, ink slightly faded but still readable, a small, simple sentence written in her own handwriting from years ago. You're allowed to start over. And she let out a breath that trembled more than she wanted it to, her eyes closing for just a second as the rain grew heavier, tapping against the pavement, against the metal of passing cars, against the silence that wrapped around her like something too familiar, too quiet, too final. And for a moment, she wondered if this was what it felt like to disappear, not all at once, but slowly, piece by piece, until nothing was left that anyone could see, until even you stopped recognizing yourself. And she almost laughed at the thought because it felt too close to the truth, too honest, too much. So she opened her eyes again and looked down at the paper, holding it tighter like it could still anchor her to something real, something steady, something that hadn't been taken yet. And that's when she heard it, the low, smooth sound of a car pulling up behind her, too quiet to be ordinary, too precise to be accidental. And she didn't turn right away because people didn't stop for people like her. Not anymore. Not in this part of the city, not at this hour. But the engine didn't leave. It idled, patient, controlled, like it was waiting, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Lily turned her head, rain slipping down her face as her eyes landed on a black car, so polished it barely seemed real against the gray street. The door opening with a soft, deliberate motion, and then he stepped out. Tall, composed, dressed like the kind of man who belonged in places she had only ever passed by. His presence cutting through the cold air with something steady, something distant, something she couldn't quite name, and for a second, just a second, her breath caught, not because of who he was, because she didn't know that yet, but because something about him felt familiar in a way that didn't make sense, like a memory she couldn't reach, like a feeling she had forgotten she once had. And he looked at her, really looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if she wasn't invisible, as if she was exactly where he expected her to be. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, low, controlled, carrying easily through the rain. You look like someone who just lost everything. And Lily felt her fingers tighten around the paper as her heart gave a small, unexpected shift, because she didn't know why a stranger would say that, and she definitely didn't know why it felt like he already knew the answer. Lily swallowed, her voice quiet but steady as she answered, "What makes you think that?" Even though part of her already knew there was no point pretending, not when everything about her probably gave it away, the soaked clothes, the tired eyes, the way she held on to that single piece of paper like it was the last thing keeping her upright. And the man stepped a little closer, stopping just enough to keep a distance that felt intentional, respectful, but still close enough for her to notice. The sharp lines of his expression, the calm control in the way he carried himself, and something else beneath it, something heavier, something that did not belong to someone who had everything. "Because I have seen that look before," he said simply, and there was no pity in his voice, no judgment either, just a quiet certainty that made her chest tighten, and for a second she did not know what to say, so she said nothing, and the silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft rhythm of rain hitting the pavement, until he spoke again. "My name is Ethan Cole," and the name landed differently than it should have, like it carried weight she could not yet understand, but she nodded anyway, her fingers tightening slightly around the paper. "Lily," she said, her voice almost lost in the rain, and he glanced briefly at the suitcase by her feet before looking back at her, his eyes steady, observant, as if measuring something she could not see. And then, without warning, he said, "I need someone to pretend to be my fiancé." And Lily blinked, certain she had misheard him. The words too strange, too sudden, too far removed from the reality she was standing in. "I am sorry, what?" she asked, a faint, disbelieving breath escaping her, and Ethan did not repeat himself like it was a joke. He simply held her gaze and said, 3 months, public appearances, family events, nothing more than what is necessary. And in return, I will pay you enough to start over wherever you want. And the world seemed to pause for a second, the rain fading into the background as his words settled around her, heavy, impossible, and yet strangely clear, and Lily shook her head slightly, instinct kicking in before logic could catch up. Why me? She asked, because that was the only question that made sense, the only thing that mattered in a moment like this, and Ethan's gaze shifted just slightly, not away, but inward, like he was choosing his answer carefully. Because you have nothing to gain by lying, he said, and there was something about the way he said it that felt too direct, too honest, and it stung more than she expected, but he continued, before she could respond. And because you will not mistake this for anything else, and that part, for some reason, made her heart pull in a way she did not understand, and she let out a slow breath, glancing down at the paper in her hand, the words written there staring back at her like they had been waiting for this exact moment. You are allowed to start over. And she almost laughed again, but this time it did not feel empty. It felt uncertain, fragile, like standing on the edge of something she could not see, and when she looked back up at him, her voice was quieter, more careful. And if I say no? She asked, and Ethan did not hesitate. Then I will get back in my car and leave, and your life will stay exactly the same as it is right now. And there was no threat in his tone, just truth, simple and unfiltered, and Lily felt something shift inside her, something small but undeniable, because for the first time all night, she was not just standing in the rain waiting for something to happen. She was being given a choice, and she did not know if it was the right one, or if it would break her even more. But as she tightened her grip on the paper one last time before folding it carefully and slipping it into her pocket, she realized that staying exactly where she was felt like the only thing she could not afford anymore. The ride was quiet in a way that felt unreal, like the city outside the tinted windows no longer belonged to her world, and Lily sat carefully in the back seat, her damp clothes pressing against the soft leather, unsure if she should move, speak, or even breathe too loudly, while Ethan sat across from her, composed, distant, his gaze occasionally lifting from his phone to her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel observed, like he was trying to understand something he had not fully figured out yet. And she found herself looking down at her hands, still slightly trembling, still holding on to that invisible edge between the life she had just left behind and the one she had not agreed to yet. And finally she broke the silence, her voice careful. You did not answer my question. And Ethan looked up, calm as ever. Which one? He asked, and she hesitated before saying, why me? And this time he did not answer immediately, his eyes resting on her. For a moment longer than before, as if weighing whether the truth was something she needed or something he was not ready to give. Because you said yes with your eyes before you said anything at all, he replied, and the answer caught her off guard, not because it made sense, but because it felt too personal, too close to something she had not even admitted to herself, and she looked away, focusing instead on the city lights passing by in soft streaks of gold and white, until the car slowed and finally stopped in front of a building that did not look real to her. Tall glass, quiet security, the kind of place she would normally walk past without ever imagining stepping inside. And when the door opened, she hesitated for just a second before stepping out, her worn shoes meeting polished stone, the difference so sharp it made her chest tighten again. And Ethan walked beside her, not touching, not guiding, but his presence alone felt like a line she had already crossed. And everything moved quickly after that. A private elevator, a silent ride. Upward, the soft hum of something expensive and controlled, until the doors opened into a space that felt more like a world than an apartment. Wide windows stretching across the walls, the city spread out below like something distant and untouchable. And Lily stopped just inside the entrance, her suitcase still in her hand, unsure where to place herself in a place that did not feel meant for her. And Ethan turned to face her fully for the first time since they arrived, his expression steady, but something in his eyes softer than before, almost unreadable. If you are going to do this, there are rules, he said, his tone clear, measured, and Lily nodded slowly, bracing herself. You will have your own room, your own space. You are not obligated to anything beyond appearances. You can leave at any time. He continued, and each word felt like it was carefully chosen, not just to set boundaries, but to reassure her in a way he did not openly acknowledge. In public, you stay close to me. You let me lead, and you do not contradict the story. And she let out a small breath, processing it all, the simplicity of it, the weight of it. And then she asked the one thing that still lingered quietly beneath everything else. And what is the story? And Ethan's gaze held hers for a moment before he answered, that I chose you. And something about the way he said it made the room feel quieter, like the air had shifted in a way she could not explain, and Lily felt her fingers brush lightly against the pocket where the folded paper rested, grounding her, reminding her of the only truth she still trusted. And as she finally set her suitcase down near the door, she realized that whatever she had just stepped into, it was no longer just about survival. It was about something far more fragile, far more uncertain, something that already felt like it could change everything if she was not careful. The first morning did not feel like a beginning. It felt like stepping into a life that had already been moving without her. And Lily stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city stretching far below in soft gray light, her reflection faint against the glass, almost like she did not fully belong in the frame. And she held her breath for a moment before letting it out slowly, grounding herself, reminding herself that this was temporary, just 3 months, just a role, just something she needed to survive. But even as she told herself that, her fingers brushed lightly against the folded paper in her pocket, and the words inside felt louder here than they ever had before. You are allowed to start over. And she turned when she heard footsteps behind her, steady, controlled, and Ethan's voice followed, calm but direct. We leave in 40 minutes. And she nodded, even though she had no idea where they were going. And he continued without waiting. There is a charity event tonight. Small, private, but important. And she watched him as he adjusted his cuff, everything about him precise, effortless, like this world was built to move around him. And she realized then how far apart they really were, not just in money, but in everything, in confidence, in control, in the way people would look at him and then look at her. And for a second doubt crept in, quiet but sharp. I do not think I can do this, she said softly, not dramatic, not emotional, just honest. And Ethan paused, his movement stopping just enough to acknowledge her words. And when he looked at her, there was something steady in his gaze, something that did not dismiss her fear. You can, he said simply, and she shook her head slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. They will know I do not belong there. And for a moment the room felt very still, like even the city outside had quieted. And then Ethan stepped closer, not too close, just enough to close the distance between uncertainty and something else, something more grounded. Then do not try to belong to them, he said, his voice lower now, more focused. Stay with me. And the words landed in a way she did not expect, not as an order, but as something else, something almost like reassurance. And she looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time she noticed the small tension in his jaw, the slight heaviness in his eyes, like this was not as effortless for him as it appeared. And she nodded, slowly, not because she was suddenly confident, but because for some reason, standing next to him felt easier than standing alone. And everything moved quickly after that. A dress waiting for her that fit too perfectly, soft fabric that felt unfamiliar against her skin, a quiet room where she changed, staring at herself in the mirror as if she was looking at someone else entirely. Someone who could walk into a room full of strangers and not disappear. And when she stepped out, Ethan was already waiting, his gaze lifting to her and holding there for a second longer than necessary, not in surprise, not in admiration, but in quiet recognition, like something had aligned exactly as it was meant to. And he extended his hand without saying anything, a simple gesture, controlled, expected, but when her fingers touched his, there was a brief warmth that neither of them acknowledged. And as they walked out together, the world shifting again around them, Lily realized that this was no longer just about pretending, because somewhere between the rain, the silence, and the way he had said stay with me, something had already begun to feel dangerously real. The ballroom was filled with soft light and quiet conversations, the kind that never truly paused but never rose above a certain level either, controlled, polished, like everything else in Ethan's world, and Lily felt it the moment they stepped inside. The shift in attention, the subtle turns of heads, the way eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary, not on her first, but on him, and then slowly, curiously, on her, measuring, questioning, placing her somewhere she did not yet understand, and her instinct was to pull back, to step half a pace behind him, to make herself smaller the way she always had. But before she could, she felt it, his hand lightly guiding hers, not gripping, not forcing, just enough pressure to bring her back beside him, and his voice, low and calm, close enough that only she could hear, "Stay with me." And she nodded, even though her heart had already started to beat faster, and they moved forward together. Introductions happening in a rhythm she could barely follow, names she would not remember, smiles that did not quite reach the eyes, until someone finally said it, directly, with just enough politeness to make it sound acceptable. "And this must be the fiancé." And Lily felt the weight of that word settle around her, heavier than she expected, and for a second she hesitated, unsure how to carry it, until Ethan answered for her, his tone even, certain, "Yes." And when his fingers brushed slightly against hers, grounding, steady, it was enough for her to lift her chin just a little, to meet their gaze without looking away, and the moment passed, but the feeling stayed, a quiet shift inside her that she could not ignore, and as the night went on, she started to notice the pattern, the subtle distance in their smiles, the way questions were asked with hidden edges, the way she was observed like something temporary, something that did not quite fit into the world they all shared. And for the first time since arriving, doubt returned, not loud, but persistent, and it grew until someone finally voiced it, softer this time, but sharper. "You are not from around here, are you?" And Lily felt the words land, simple but cutting, and she opened her mouth, unsure what to say, but before she could answer, Ethan's hand tightened just slightly around hers, and he stepped forward just enough to shift the space, his presence calm but unmistakably firm. "She is exactly where she is supposed to be," he said, and the room seemed to quiet just a fraction, not because he raised his voice, but because he did not need to, and something in the way he said it changed the air around them, and Lily felt it, the shift, the way the attention softened, the way the question dissolved, without needing an answer. And when she glanced up at him, just for a second, she saw something she had not seen before, not control, not distance, but something protective, something real, and it caught her off guard in a way nothing else had that night. And for the rest of the evening, she stayed close, just like he told her, not because she had to, but because it felt easier that way, because every time the room felt too large, too distant, his presence brought it back into focus. And when they finally stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around them like a quiet release, Lily let out a breath she had been holding for hours, her shoulders lowering just slightly, and before she could stop herself, she said it, honest, unfiltered, "Thank you." And Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, the city lights reflecting softly in his eyes, and for a moment he did not respond, like the words had reached somewhere deeper than expected, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, almost thoughtful. "You did not need saving," he said, and Lily shook her head gently, a small, uncertain smile touching her lips. "Maybe not," she replied, "but you stayed anyway." And something in his expression shifted then, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed without either of them realizing when it happened, and as they stood there in the quiet, neither moving right away, Lily felt it again, that same fragile, dangerous feeling from earlier, the one she was not supposed to have, the one that did not belong in something that was supposed to be temporary, because somewhere between the way he had said she belongs here and the way he had not let go of her hand right away, it no longer felt like they were just pretending. The city felt quieter on the way back, or maybe it was just the way the silence settled between them now, no longer distant, no longer uncertain, but filled with something unspoken that neither of them seemed ready to name. And Lily leaned her head lightly against the cool glass of the window, watching the lights pass by in soft streaks, her thoughts slower than before, heavier in a way that did not feel entirely bad, just unfamiliar. And when the car stopped and they stepped back into the building, everything around them returned to that same controlled stillness, polished floors, quiet elevators, the soft hum of a life that never seemed to pause. And yet something had shifted, something small but steady, like a thread pulling tighter between them without either of them noticing when it began. And inside the apartment, Lily slipped off her shoes near the door, her movements quieter now, more natural, like she was slowly learning how to exist in a space that once felt impossible. And Ethan moved past her without a word at first, loosening his tie, the tension in his shoulders finally visible now that they were alone. And for a moment she hesitated, unsure if she should say anything, unsure if the distance from earlier had returned. But then she saw it, the slight unsteadiness in his breath, the way his hand paused briefly against the edge of the table as if grounding himself, and something in her responded before she could think too much about it. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, her voice careful, and Ethan did not answer right away, his gaze fixed somewhere distant, somewhere far beyond the room they were standing in. And when he finally spoke, it was quieter than she had ever heard it. "It was a long night," he said, but it was not the full truth. She could hear that much. And instead of stepping back, instead of leaving him to that silence, Lily moved a little closer, not too close, just enough to let him know she was still there. And after a moment, she reached for a glass of water, placing it gently within his reach without making it feel like something more than it was. And Ethan glanced at it, then at her, something unreadable passing through his expression, something softer, something that did not belong to the version of him the world saw. And he took the glass, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest second, and neither of them pulled away immediately, not because it meant something they understood, but because it felt natural in a way that did not need explanation. And the silence that followed was different now, not empty, not distant, but quiet in a way that felt shared. And Lily found herself sitting down on the edge of the couch, her hands resting lightly in her lap, watching him as he finally sat across from her, the distance between them smaller than it had ever been. And after a moment she spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost hesitant. "You do not have to pretend when we are alone." And the words hung in the air between them, simple but carrying more weight than she expected. And Ethan looked at her then, really looked at her, his expression shifting just slightly, like something inside him had been caught off guard. And for a long second he said nothing, as if he was deciding whether to let that truth exist or to push it away. And when he finally answered, his voice was low, almost a whisper, "I do not know how not to." And that was it. No explanation, no defense, just honesty, raw and quiet. And it settled between them in a way that changed everything. Because for the first time, Lily saw it clearly, not just the control, not just the distance, but the space beneath it, the part of him that had been carrying something alone for far too long. And she did not move closer. She did not reach out again. She simply stayed where she was, present, steady, letting the silence hold them both without forcing it to become anything else. And somewhere in that quiet, without promises, without labels, without either of them saying it out loud, the line between what was real and what was supposed to be pretend blurred. Just a little more, and neither of them stepped back from it. The next few days passed in a rhythm that felt almost steady, almost real, and that was the part Lily did not know how to handle, because it was easier when everything felt like an act, when every glance and every word had a clear boundary. But now there were moments that did not feel rehearsed, moments that slipped through quietly, like the way Ethan would pause when she entered a room, or the way his voice softened just slightly when he spoke to her when no one else was around. And she tried not to think about it too much, tried to keep her focus on the simple truth that this was temporary, that it had an end, that it was built on something that was never meant to last. But even then, the feeling stayed, quiet and persistent, like something waiting just beneath the surface, and it followed her into the next event, larger this time, brighter, filled with more eyes, more voices, more expectations, the kind of place where nothing stayed hidden for long. And as they stepped inside, the air felt different, sharper, more deliberate, like the room already knew something before they even arrived. And Lily felt it immediately, the shift in attention, not just curiosity this time, but something closer to scrutiny, something that made her hold her breath just a little longer. And Ethan must have felt it too, because his hand found hers without hesitation, steady, grounding, and she stayed close, just like before, But this time it felt less like instruction and more like instinct, and everything moved quickly. Introductions, conversations, polite smiles that carried more weight than they showed. Until the moment came that changed everything. Quiet at first, almost unnoticeable, just a voice in the background. Then another, then a subtle shift in the way people looked at her, not with curiosity anymore, but with something sharper, something that felt like they already knew the answer to a question she had not been asked yet. And then she heard it, clear enough this time to stop her completely. She was seen leaving a shelter 3 nights ago, and the words landed harder than she expected, not because they were untrue, but because they were not meant to be spoken here, not in this room, not in front of these people. And Lily felt her chest tighten, her fingers instinctively pulling back just slightly, the space between her and Ethan widening by the smallest amount. And she did not look at him right away, because she was not sure what she would see. Doubt, distance, regret. But the silence that followed felt louder than anything else, and when she finally turned, her eyes meeting his, she saw it. Not rejection, not anger, but something else, something conflicted, something held back, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the world around them continuing as if nothing had happened, as if everything had not just shifted beneath their feet. And Lily realized then that this was the part they had never prepared for, the part where the story they created met the truth she could not hide. And she took a small step back, not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to create space, her voice quiet when she finally spoke. "It is fine," she said, even though it was not. Even though everything in her felt like it was unraveling in slow motion, and Ethan's expression changed then. Just slightly, like he wanted to say something, like he was about to, but he did not. And that was the moment that stayed with her. Not the whispers, not the looks, but the silence, the one that came from him. And it was enough for her to understand that whatever this had become, whatever it almost was, it still had limits. It still had lines that could not be crossed. And without another word, she stepped away fully this time, her hand slipping from his, the absence immediate, undeniable, and she walked toward the exit without looking back, her heart steady in a way that did not match the storm inside her. Because she had known from the beginning that this was not real, she had told herself that again and again, but somehow, somewhere along the way, she had forgotten just how much that truth could still hurt. The night air felt colder than it should have as Lily stepped out onto the quiet street, the noise of the event fading behind her like something distant and unimportant. And for a moment she just stood there, her breath uneven, her chest tight, trying to steady herself before everything inside her broke all at once. But it did not come like that. It came slowly, quietly, the realization settling in piece by piece, heavier with every second, because it was not what they said about her that hurt the most. It was what he did not say, the silence he chose when it mattered. And she closed her eyes briefly, letting out a breath that trembled despite her effort to keep it steady. And when she opened them again, she reached into her pocket, her fingers finding the folded paper without hesitation, pulling it out and holding it in front of her like she had done so many times before, the words still there, still simple, still unchanged. "You are allowed to start over." But this time they felt different, not like a comfort, but like a decision she could not avoid anymore. And she swallowed, her grip tightening just slightly before she folded it again with care, slipping it back into her pocket as if placing something fragile where it belonged. And then she moved, not quickly, not running, just walking with a quiet determination that felt steadier than anything she had felt in days. And by the time she reached the apartment, everything was silent, untouched, as if the space had been waiting for her to return. And she stepped inside slowly, her eyes moving across the room that had started to feel almost familiar, almost safe. And for a moment she hesitated, her hand resting lightly against the back of a chair, her thoughts pulling in different directions, part of her wanting to stay, to wait, to see if he would come back and say the things he did not say before, but another part of her, quieter but stronger, reminding her that she had already seen enough, that she could not keep standing in a place where she had to question whether she belonged. And that part won, gently but firmly, and she moved toward her room, picking up her suitcase, placing her few things inside with careful, deliberate motions, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward one step at a time. And when she was done, she paused, her gaze drifting toward the space they had shared, the small moments that had begun to mean more than they should have, the quiet conversations, the way he had said stay with me. And she let herself feel it for just a second, the weight of it, the loss of it, before she exhaled softly and reached for the one thing that mattered most, the paper in her pocket, pulling it out once more and placing it gently on the table, not leaving it behind as something forgotten, but as something he needed to see, something he needed to understand, and beneath it, she placed the ring he had given her, the symbol of something that was never meant to be real, but had felt real anyway, and she looked at them both for a moment longer, her eyes soft but certain, before she turned and walked toward the door, her steps quiet but unwavering. And when she stepped outside, closing it behind her without looking back, the air felt different again, not lighter, not easier, but honest. And as she walked forward into the night with nothing but her suitcase and the space she was finally choosing for herself, she realized that starting over did not mean finding something new right away. Sometimes it meant walking away from something that almost felt like everything, because almost was never going to be enough. Ethan felt it the moment he stepped inside, not just the silence, but the absence of something that had quietly become part of his world, something he had not noticed slipping into place until it was gone. And his eyes moved across the room with a growing stillness, landing on the table where the ring and the folded paper rested side by side. And for a second he did not move, because seeing them there made everything clear in a way nothing else could. And when he finally walked over, his steps slower than usual, he reached for the paper first, unfolding it with careful hands as if it held more than just words. And when he read the line again, "You are allowed to start over," it did not feel like something meant for her anymore. It felt like something he had failed to understand when it mattered, and his jaw tightened slightly as the memory of her standing there, waiting without asking, trusting without saying it out loud, came back with quiet precision. And he realized then that he had not lost her in that moment because of who she was. He had lost her because of who he chose to be, silent, controlled, distant, and for the first time, that version of himself felt like something he did not want to keep, and he let out a slow breath, folding the paper again before slipping it into his pocket, not as something to hold on to, but as something to act on, and he left the ring where it was, because he understood now that what mattered was not what he had given her before, but what he was willing to give without conditions. And when he stepped back outside, the night air felt sharper, clearer, and he moved through it with a purpose that did not hesitate, because this time he was not calculating, not waiting, he was choosing, and it did not take long before he saw her, walking steadily down the sidewalk, her suitcase beside her, her posture calm but certain, and he slowed as he approached, giving her space before speaking, his voice steady but different now, stripped of anything unnecessary. "Lily," and she stopped, turning to face him with a quiet composure that told